All right, if you will join me in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we're at the end of chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25, like I said, just barely chapter 25. We'll move into chapter 26. Before we do that, I felt like this was a good time. We're in the midst of really kind of the beginning of the patriarchs. Abraham is the first that is kind of given that title of patriarch. So I want to talk a little bit about patriarchs and then what we term this period, this era of world or religious history, the patriarchal period. Anybody know? I know you were hoping for a pop quiz right here on a Wednesday night. Anybody know the meaning of the word patriarch? Yeah, it's half of it. Patri is the first part of it is patriarch. Patri, it means father. Then the last half is ark, which means ruler. Arch or ark means ruler, so it's father ruler. Is the meaning of the word. And so Abraham, we have Abraham is the first. Isaac, who we're in the middle of his life now. By the way, we haven't made this observation, but Isaac is, I don't know how to really phrase it. I don't want to insult Isaac, but Isaac is the most obscure of the patriarchs. We're really told less about his life than any of the other patriarchs. And that seems strange at first glance because we think of Abraham, Isaac, he's the second on that list. But really, the stories of Isaac are just mostly about his interaction with other people. There's very few of him standing alone. But anyway, I have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob would all classify as being these patriarchs. And because of that, these father rulers who ruled their family in many ways, but the one we're most interested in, they ruled them spiritually. And because of their term, then we refer to this period of history as the patriarchal period, in which they were ruled not by the law of Moses and not by the law of Christ, but they are ruled by the fathers in their household. And so the whole period, starting with the creation, is known as the patriarchal period. And this is the chart that you'll see a lot of times of the three, or so, many times they're circles, the three periods, the patriarchal period, the Mosaic period, of course, that started with the giving of the law at Mount Sinai and ended at the death of Christ on the cross. And then the Christian period that started at the cross and will continue till the end of time. And again, this is the chart that you will see so often, but I think this is probably a more accurate chart. That we don't think of it in those terms, but the patriarchal period did not really end at the giving of the law. It ended for one group of people, one family, and the family that we're studying here, and then they entered into the Mosaic period. And I guess technically, you could argue that this chart's still accurate because this is talking about eras of time, periods of time, and they don't have to be all inclusive. We talk about like maybe the Roman Empire ruled the world, and we might call that the Roman Empire period, where there may have been parts of the world that weren't ruled by the Roman Empire. One little island over here that wasn't ruled by the Romans, but it's still called the Roman Empire. So I wouldn't fault somebody too hard on this, but the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob that we're studying right now, will enter into a new period, a new way of dealing with God or God dealing with them. But the Gentiles would have still carried on that same way, those who were outside until the coming of Christ. The cross would have ended both of those. And so, in a sense, you could argue both charts are accurate, but a lot of times we don't think about the Gentiles that were living at the time of Moses, at the time of Joshua, the times of the judges, the divided kingdom. All of that would have still If they wanted to approach God, would have approached God through the same way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have. And so, in fact, Paul will use kind of that as an argument in his writings, which would have been something that I think a good Jewish student would have known logically, but it would have hurt their heart to hear it, to hear that Abraham wasn't a Jew. And that God accepts the faith of people who have not been circumcised. Abraham wasn't circumcised very late in his life, but he still had a relationship with God through faith. And Paul will use that argumentation to the Jews to show that God's relationship, God's desire for faith, it was not limited to just the lineage of Abraham. So, all right, so we're in the midst of this. We saw in chapter 25 last time. Remember that chapter 25 is not necessarily in chronological order. We have the record of Abraham's wife Keturah, and it's highly likely that he married Keturah before Sarah died. We don't know that. I can't prove that. But just because the story is here's Sarah's death, and now we have the record of Abraham marrying Keturah, doesn't mean that those things happened in that order. The scripture doesn't always, ancient history doesn't always work that way. In fact, I think you could probably make a pretty good argument that Keturah was married to Abraham was married to Keturah before Sarah passed. We also know that this chapter is not in chronological order because we have the death recorded of Abraham. Chapter 25, beginning in verse 7. Abraham dies at 175. From that, we could do the math that he would have lived in Canaan, in this area. He would have lived there for about 100 years. And so we have Abraham's death recorded in chapter 25. But then later in this chapter, we have the birth of Jacob and Esau. And so, again, we have the death of Abraham, and now we have the birth of Jacob and Esau in the biblical timeline. But again, the chronology doesn't add up. Jacob and Esau would have been about 15 years old when Abraham died. And so, again, the stories are told more topically than they are necessarily chronologically in this. And so, Isaac is 40 years old. Verse 20 tells us when he took Rebekah as wife. Remember, we told the interesting story of how Rebekah was found for him. And again, we could do some math to figure out some of the timing there. But he was 40 years old, we're told, when he took Rebekah as wife. And what we're going to see, we see this in Scripture a lot, but particularly in the book of Genesis, it seems like we have a lot of repetitions, a lot of similar stories. We had Abraham lying to Abimelech and to Pharaoh first, and then Abimelech about the relationship to Sarah. That story is going to be repeated coming up by his son. We see the repetition of the difficulty of having children. You know, Sarah, we know the story well of Abraham and Sarah, and now that story is repeated with Isaac and Rebekah. Another thing we're going to see repeated is just terrible family relationships, dysfunctional families, choosing favorites. That's going to be a common theme throughout this. Deceiving and lying is going to be a common theme throughout all of this, and it seems like they never learned their lessons from the previous generation. So Isaac pleads with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and God grants that plea. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And so now she is expecting, and what she doesn't know is that she's expecting twins. She's going to learn that before the birth. This is maybe their first example of a spiritual sonogram, if you will, that she's going to know that she has twins. I'll tell an embarrassing story on myself. My mother experienced the reversal of this. back before the days of sonograms and all those testings. So the doctors told Mom she was having twins. But turned out they wasn't twins. It was just one big fat baby, and that was me. And so the reversal of this happened with my mom. But anyway, she's conceived. She has the children within her, and as many expectant mothers, when something happens, she gets nervous and she's worried that something's not right with this birth. In fact, she says, the New King James says in verse 22, "If all is well, why am I this way?" And maybe all pregnant women have felt that way at some point or another. But she is now told, the Lord says to her in verse 23, "Two nations are in your womb." And I would imagine, I don't have much to base this on, that if you were carrying twins, you'd probably feel like you had two nations inside you, but two nations are in your womb. And that's underline in your mind, at least, those word nations, because what the language here is going to be a little muddled in the sense that it sounds like are you talking about the babies that are inside her? Or are you talking about the nations? And so this prophecy, the statement is about the nations, not necessarily about the two children that are in her womb, that they're going to be two nations, is what is being said. "And two nations shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Well, now you could argue, well, that kind of happened to the two kids, right? But that's not the prophecy. The prophecy is about the nations that would spring from her womb. That one would be stronger than the other, and that the older would serve the younger. Again, the nations, not necessarily the children. "So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb." And the text says the first one came out red. Now, we don't really, or scholars much smarter than me, don't know really what to make of that. In fact, one book that I was reading says, "What baby doesn't come out red?" And you might think, well, maybe red hair, but that's not a trait in the Semitic people. I mean, in fact, how many redheads do you see in the Middle East right now? It's just not a common thing. And so we're really not sure what to make of that. It might be a little bit of the foreshadowing of he's going to get the nickname Red later on, but it's not from this, it's from something else. So we again don't know really what to make of that, the sense he's red. The other one I think we can figure out, he was a hairy, like a hairy garment all over. And so they called his name Esau. Esau means hairy. So again, his original name is not red, not based upon him coming out red, but based on him coming out hairy. And so they're twins, but as you know, with twins, you're still going to have a firstborn. Maybe just seconds or minutes in difference, but so he is born first. And afterward, his brother comes out, and his hand took a hold of Esau's heel. And so Jacob was called, or the child was called Jacob. And the word Jacob literally means one who takes the heel, or a supplanter is the idea. And the picture that I get is, trying to think of somebody that's trying to climb a ladder to get a prize. There's some contest, you climb into this contest, you climb the ladder, and there's a bag of money at the top. And so the first person gets there and starts climbing the ladder. Well, the next person comes. What's he going to do? He's going to grab that guy by the foot and try to pull him off the ladder so that he can come up. And so that's what happens in this birth. And it is prophetic because it's saying that he is wanting to supplant, to replace, take the place. So it literally means grab the heel, but grab the heel so you can yank them down off the ladder and you can take the place. And so there's the record of the birth of Isaac and Rebekah's two sons, Esau and Jacob. So the boys grew. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob, the New King James says, Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. I think sometimes we can make that a little bit, I can remember as a kid, whether I made this up in my own mind or whether a teacher planted that in my mind, is you get the idea that Jacob's maybe a little bit of a sissy. He's a mama's boy, he stays inside the house and maybe he's a little lazy, but that's not really what's being talked about here. And so let's not make too much of that here Esau's this big, rough, hairy hunter, and he's the man's man, and Jacob's, he's a little, but that's not necessarily what's being talked about here. And there's certainly no indication that Jacob's lazy, that's implied in any of this. So Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, what's interesting to me is that we're told why Esau was Jacob's favorite, but we're not told why. Uh, I said that wrong. Isaac's favorite, but we're not told why Jacob is Rebekah's favorite. And all we can do is speculate. May have been she just felt sorry for him. Dad's got a favorite, then you're left. So I guess I'm stuck with you. You're my favorite. But that's going to be the source of, obviously, of problems. I don't imagine you consult any parenting book and they're going to give you this advice to pick one of the kids and make them your favorite. We're going to see that again, kind of comes up in biblical history, doesn't it? The most famous of those stories, of course, is going to be Joseph, of the favoritism. But and again, what impacts me here is that they apparently don't learn from the previous. You think, okay, that didn't turn out good for Jacob and Esau, so let's not do that with Joseph. And not a whole lot of time transpires, really, relatively speaking, between these incidents. So now we have the story that we talked about this in our exhortation last Wednesday night. Jacob has cooked this stew. Esau comes back from the field and he is weary. Now, we don't know exactly what all to make of this story in this sense that how much of Esau is like exaggeration. But he just sounds like he's starving to death, doesn't he? He's not going to live another day if he doesn't get a bite of this soup and get it right now. Now, we don't know. Maybe there's some truth to that. Or maybe it's just him completely exaggerating the situation, as we often do when we're hungry. But he says, feed me some of that red stew, for I am weary. And therefore his name is called Edom. This is the red. It was a red stew, and so his name is called Edom. That means red. And so his birth name is Esau. Basically, his nickname becomes Edom. And as we know, his descendants are going to be a nation. Remember, she was told 2 nations are in your womb, Esau and Jacob. Now, from Jacob, we know the nation that's going to be. But now from Esau, instead of the Esauites, they're going to be the Edomites. And we're going to run into them, to that nation, later in the biblical story. And Jacob says, sell me your birthright. Now, again, the story is more complicated than maybe we have looked at it. We talked again in our exhortation last Wednesday night about the New Testament calls Esau a profane man, that he didn't value what was to be valued and put the value on things that he should not have. And so certainly Esau's to be condemned. The Bible condemns him in this. But I tell you, if you really look at this story, Jacob doesn't come across in good light. Your brother's starving to death, or at least he thinks he is, and you got a big pot of soup. You're not going to give your brother a pot of soup for free. Of course, I grew up with brothers. I can maybe relate to this a little bit, but I'd hope I'd have more compassion than that if he truly was in those dire straits. And so, in this story, there's really no hero in this story. In fact, Esau says, "Look, I'm about to die. So what good's a birthright going to be to me? Birthright doesn't only works if you're alive, but I'm about to die." And so he sells him the stew for his birthright. Larry? That may be the first instance in recorded history of a male doing the cooking, because it was always, that was the women's work. So it kind of reinforces the idea he was in the tent, you know, stirring up soup and practicing his crochet and whatever. Yeah. And I think the lesson Larry's wanting us to see here, it didn't work out good, and so men don't need to do the cooking. Is that the point you're getting to there? I didn't mean to. It didn't work out good then, and so we just swore it off. We're not going to do it anymore. Um, yeah, and maybe the exception, Jacob says dwelt in tents in verse 27, and he's cooking a stew, and so the only acceptable cooking by men is going to be outside the tent. So barbecuing is allowed, but not that. So again, there's a lot about this whole sequence of events that is lost upon our 21st century American culture minds, and we grasp, and so many of the things that are difficult for us to understand in Bible history is just that's not the way we do things. Because you think about this whole story, how Esau loses out on really everything, just seems so odd to our way of thinking of it. I mean, you think about it if with your children, if your children had conspired on their own to give up part of their inheritance, what would you say to that? If yeah, we had Blake and Keely had two kids, and if the kids came to us and say, Keely sold me her inheritance, I get her half when y'all die. Well, I'd say, no, you don't. I didn't get any of that money. Your decision doesn't affect me giving out my inheritance. We would just say, that's silly. You boys, you sold that for nothing. I'm still going to give the inheritance the way I want to give it. I'm the father. But so again, it's just not our minds and our culture isn't set up that way. So it just seems odd to us. Max? Yeah. You would have seen the importance and the value, certainly in that culture. Again, we don't think that much of it because we don't live in that patriarchal sense, but you were literally going to be the patriarch of your family and what that meant. And yes, when you talk about the profanity of Esau, there's several things you could put on that list, that being one of them. Uh, just from a financial standpoint, again, it's a little muddy how if the culture how it's changed through the years, but it seems from the biblical record that this meant that this birthright that you basically got double the inheritance. So the easiest way for me to illustrate it, if you had three children and the oldest son gets the birthright, the oldest son would get 50%. And then the other two sons would get what's left, split the next 50. So 50, 25, 25. So that's a big deal just from a financial standpoint. But, and again, we don't know how much what you would assume they were familiar with the promises to Grandpa Abraham, that this isn't, I'm not just getting the status of patriarch of just some random family. I'm getting the status of patriarch of the family, the most important family on earth as far as God is concerned. And so, yeah, it just shows the depravity of his profanity for sure. Nick, and then Larry. Mm. Yeah.
So you kind of wonder, well, if did Jacob resent Esau and him getting all the inheritance and I ain't getting nothing? He's going to come back half starved to death, and I'm going to have this too, and let's see what happens.
Yeah.
There was probably some resentment there.
Yeah, and there's a lot we don't know. If parents have picked favorites, has mom whispered in his ear that, let me tell you what God told me. God told me you were the best. That you were going to be. And so a lot in here that we don't know, and a lot again that's so different from our way of thinking. That in a good way, I would argue. But Larry.
First one gets property, but it's almost like there was a title involved, kind of like the Duke of whatever.
Oh yeah.
What Jacob's after, as much as anything, is being the patriarch, and another point I don't know, Esau was off running around chasing game and stuff. It's almost like he didn't care about the family business because, the family business was raising the sheep and stuff. And if you're hungry for meat, you go out and you get a sheep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, that he's off in the woods for a week chasing a deer or something.
Yeah.
It's like he's off gallivanting and having a good time and not even paying attention to the family business at all.
Yeah, yeah. There, like I said, there's a lot of layers of complications to this very complicated family. Now, before we get too far, there are three separate things, and they're separate, but they're kind of connected. But we need to keep them kind of separate in our minds. That here is the birthright. That's what Jacob purchases or trades to get is the birthright. Then very quickly we're going to see that some more deception is involved in order to get the father's blessing, and that seemed to be separate, somehow connected but yet separate from the birthright. So we have the birthright and then the father's blessing, and then even separate from that is what God is doing with these two sons. God's not bound. We talked about how it's strange to me that Isaac would be bound by this deal that his two sons made about the birthright. In our culture, we'd say, I'm not doing that. I don't care what deal you made over soup. You silly kids, we're doing it my way. But that apparently that's not the way it was done in that culture. So we found it strange that Isaac is beholden. Well, certainly God's not beholden to some deal made over a bowl of soup. God's also not beholden to the deception that Isaac ends up blessing the wrong son in all of that. None of that. God is like, oh, I thought it was going to be Esau, but now I guess they did that and he did that, so I guess it's got to be Jacob. Now we know that, of course, because the prophecy precedes all of this, and so we've got three separate components here. We've got the birthright, we've got the blessing by the Father, and then we've got God's plans. And those are three separate things, but you can also see where they're kind of connected in this. Now, you might think, let's complicate it even more, that the statement that is made about the two nations that are in your womb, Rebecca, and it's actually going to be reversed. There's two types of prophecy. If we want to use prophecy in the sense of predicting the future. And that's prophecy is much more than that, of course. But in that sense, there's two types of prophecy where God can foresee the future. One is God can just see what's going to happen. God's eternal, He has that ability. He can know what choices men or women make, and therefore He can say, this is going to happen. I can just see into the future and I see that that's going to happen. That's one form of prophecy, and that's the way we normally think of it. But there's another form of prophecy that God says this is going to happen in the future because I'm going to make it happen. It's just like somebody says, I'm going to predict you're going to have a black eye before the night is over. Well, there's two ways. They either know your personality and you're going to tick somebody off and somebody's going to hit you, or they're going to fulfill that prophecy by giving you the black eye. And so, but in here, we try to determine, it seems, especially from the New Testament, Paul's argument that this isn't God just seeing, oh, one's going to sell their birthright and then there's going to be deception. And so I can see that that's going to happen. Well, Paul in the New Testament, in the book of Romans, says, no, God chose this. God wasn't just predicting the bad choices of these family members. God is choosing Jacob over Esau, and so that further complicates, everything. All right, so now we get into chapter 26, and we've got Isaac and Abimelech. Does that name sound familiar? Not Isaac, of course, that doesn't sound familiar, but Abimelech. Now remember that over in chapter 20, in chapter 12, Abraham goes down into Egypt and tells Sarah, say you're my sister. Then later he goes down into Gerar and encounters Abimelech in chapter 20, and there he says, she's my sister. And so that deception. And so now Isaac is going to encounter Abimelech and do the same thing Dad did. So Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. Now remember what we said in chapter 20, if you can remember, that we think that the term Abimelech is a title rather than a name, like Pharaoh or like Caesar is this title that kind of becomes a name, but it's really a title. The word Abimelech means my father is king. And so we think that that's maybe a title rather than a name. It's highly unlikely, it's not impossible, it's highly unlikely that this is the same Abimelech. We know at least 40 years has transpired because that's how old Isaac is when he's married. And so Isaac wasn't born when Abraham encountered Abimelech, and now Isaac is 40 years old when he's married. And so we know it's at least 40 years. Some scholars think it's probably closer to 80 years have transpired, but we know at least 40 because that's how old he is when he's married. We don't know exactly how much time has transpired after his marriage in this event. But anyway, God, before he goes down, or as he goes down, he is told not to go to Egypt. And the promise that was made to his father Abraham is repeated there in verse 4. I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And so the promise to Abraham is now repeated. And he goes down and again makes the claim, she is my sister. Now, Abraham and Sarah, she really was his sister. Now, remember, his cousin, but I don't think that's the lie. There is deception here, but that term sister seemed to be a broad term to refer to basically any female relative could be referred to by that term. And so that's not the deceit. The deceit that he leaves off, she is my wife, for the same reason. They're going to kill me to get to you for this reason. But God appears to Abimelech, makes the warning. And so similar thing happens, like, what are you trying to do? Get me killed here? What's going on? And so again, just a repetition of that same event. There ends up being an agreement between Abimelech and Isaac, much like the previous Abimelech and Abraham. And this one had to do with the wells. We won't read all of that. There's dispute over wells that had been dug and then redug. And so that ends this encounter, at least, with Isaac and Abimelech. Esau, the end of this wife, Esau takes a wife from the Hittites, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and the chapter ends the saying, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. And so the family travails continue. So Esau and his wife are a grief of mind to their parents, and they'll not be the last children to do that. So now in chapter 27, we have the transference of the blessing. Remember, we had the birthright, and now we have the blessing. They are connected, but they're not the same thing. And so it says in chapter 27, verse 1, it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau his older son to him and said, My son. And he says, Here am I. And he said, Behold, now I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. Well, preachers a lot of times will tell you from the pulpit and from the classroom lectern that don't ever take my word for something. You check it in your own Bible. Well, I'm going to make one exception to this. Take my word for this because I don't want to have to do the math. But we can figure out the ages of here, and some of these are very difficult, and it feels like a math problem from school, and this is certainly one of them. But we could figure out from math wise that Isaac is 137 years old at this point when he says, I'm old and I don't know the day of my death. And so he's 137. The twins are 77. And so, when you hear this story and maybe even the pictures in the children's classrooms, you got two almost teenage looking boys in here that are involved in mom's deception here. But they've been 77 years old when they're doing this, playing these games with mom and dad here. Now, what's interesting also, he's 137 and he says he can't see. Behold, I am old. I don't know the day of my death. I don't know if he was sick at this particular time or just feeling particularly sorry for himself because you read this, he's just on his deathbed. Well, he's going to live another 43 years. And so he's going to get bed sores being in this deathbed. And so he's 137 now. He'll live for another 43 years before he dies. And I wouldn't maybe ascribe deception here. I think he probably really thought, because he did say, I don't know. Well, you certainly don't know because you're going to live 43 more years. But he asked, kind of almost makes it sound like a last meal. You take your bow, go out there and get some of that good wild game that I like, that I may bless you before I die. So he seems to think that he is on death's door here. And of course, we know the story that Rebecca has a favorite. And so while he's out hunting, she gets Isaac and says, we're going to fool Dad and get you the blessing. And so they prepare a food in his place. They go out and just get some goats. You can't tell the difference between goat and a deer if you fix it just right. And so they go get these goats and he prepares those. But he says, now wait a minute, I'm smooth skin and my brother is hairy. And so, well, what a coincidence. We just killed a goat. And so let's go get that goat skin, some of that hair. And when you father reaches out to touch you, that he'll feel the hairiness of the goat and think that it's you. And so they go through this elaborate means to deceive their father. And again, it works. It takes a little persuasion. In fact, Jacob asked several times. Isaac, I keep calling him Jacob. Isaac asked several times, is that really you? Is that really you? Is that really you? Well, yeah, that's me. That's me. That's me. And so finally he imparts the blessing to him. And then about that time, just like a movie, Esau comes in right after they've left and finds out what's happened. Again, in our minds, in my 21st century culture mind, one of my kids tricks me and tricked me into saying something. I'm just like, well, no, that deal's off. You lied to me. I don't have to keep my end of the bargain, so forget you. But again, that's not what happens here. That they seem to be bound by this birthright deal that was made without their knowledge, and now Esau is out because Isaac feels bound by the imparting of the promise, even though it was done through deception. And so he ends up blessing Esau in a different way, in a lesser way. And says to him in verse 39, Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck. Well, as we might expect, here's tough, rough Esau, and he's not happy. And here's, just by a little bit, little brother, who seems to be a little on the softer side than his rough brother. And so he just flees. He knows that this isn't going to end well. I've tricked him twice. I got his birthright for a mess of stew. And now, with mom's help, I've gotten the blessing. And so he's going to get that bow and arrow and go hunting for a different kind of prey. And so Jacob flees from Esau for fear of his life. And that's where we'll have to draw a line here. We'll pick up there at chapter 28 next time.